Başlık 2026 konaklama sektörü görünümü ve Sales-EMEA satışlardan sorumlu başkan yardımcısı Aoife Roche geliyor alkışlarla. I would like to invite Miss Roche to the stage to make her speech.
Good morning.
Hello,
Thank you
Ms.
so much.
Roche.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I might give a few moments for people to take their seats if they like before I start. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. So SGR, part of the CoStar Group company, if you don't know us, we've been collecting hotel performance data for over 40 years now. And with 92,000 hotels participating, that enables us to give some fantastic insights into how the hotel performance is looking globally. So first up, 2025 has been another challenging year for the hotel industry. We have seen positive KPIs at year-end, particularly in Europe, but with consumer sentiment at an all-time low, with indecision around uncertainty at an all-time high, businesses and consumers have had a difficult time in 2025, and we've certainly felt that in the industry. At year-end, however, we have seen positive performance in Europe and across most of the globe. So I'm going to take the next 15 minutes or so to give you those insights. First up is demand. At a global level, demand has grown by 8% since 2019. So we've seen positive growth year on year, although you will notice that there's a little bit of softening in 2025. Now, much of that demand growth has been focused on the Asia-Pacific region, which was later to recover from the pandemic years, and in Middle East and Africa, so 13.5% lift in demand in the Middle East and Africa since 2019. However, if we isolate the GCC countries, there has been a 34% growth in GCC. Now, I'll bring your attention to the Americas, which is the only region that is seeing negative growth in demand on 2019. One of the core reasons for that is that international demand has not fully recovered to the United States in particular. South American demand is actually growing, but the United States has seen a decline in demand. And one of the reasons is international demand. So 4.7 million passengers less have traveled to the United States internationally since 2019. And on the flip side, 9.7 million travelers, US travelers, have traveled outbound to other countries, which of course has helped Europe. And you can see European demand is up around 2% since 2019. Now, there are many variations in performance depending on the market you operate in, depending on the class or chain scale that you operate in too. So I'll focus a little bit on that as I go throughout the presentation. But as I mentioned, global demand is down. It has softened slightly on last year, but there are some huge variations. If we look at Africa, right at the top, 5% growth in demand. Much of that is attributed to the Red Sea resorts that are growing by 11% in 2025. GCC countries, as I mentioned, up just over 4%. And Europe in the middle there, anywhere between 1.5 to 2% growth in demand. Doesn't feel very strong, but when you compare that to the global average, it looks pretty good. And as I mentioned, the US going back in demand, as is the Caribbean and Mexico. Now, we have a favorable backdrop in that supply is not growing significantly. So there's been under 2% growth in supply over the last 2 years. We are all aware of the financial constraints that are linked to that limited supply growth. And much of the growth has actually been in conversions. So there has been a lot of movement, but it's not really adding to the room count. Now, that is, for hoteliers, often a favorable backdrop, because what it does allow, of course, is for occupancy to grow. And we can see that Europe has grown by just 1% year on year, whereas we compare that to North America with that demand declining, as I showed in earlier slides, occupancy has declined by 1%. And then to the east, mainland China has declined by 3%, whereas Asia Pacific, excluding mainland China, has grown by 7%. Now, much of the mainland China business is, of course, traveling within the APAC region, which is generating that additional demand. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Middle East doing extremely well with heightened demand continued since 2019. Now, the ADR picture looks slightly different in that it is a little bit more buoyant than occupancy. So you can see Europe growing at 2% versus the 1% occupancy that I showed earlier. Mainland China declining, of course, missing a lot of international demand in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong, very much dependent on that international traveler to drive rate. And if we remove the South American and South African countries where inflation is really boosting that double-digit growth in ADR, we can see that it really is the Middle East and Asia Pacific that are leading the charge in terms of ADR growth. Now, those variances that we see across the continents are also evident within Europe itself. Now, Europe was going to be a challenging year. We knew that the summer months were going to be hugely challenging with non-repeat Olympic events, non-repeat Euros for Germany, and of course Taylor Swift completing her Eras tour. Now, what we didn't know that March we would have an announcement of Liberation Day, which threw the markets into array, and so to hotel performance, as you can see here. But for the most part, all 11 out of 12 months saw positive RevPAR growth in Europe. So it was actually, and it ended up being a very good year with the last quarter performing very, very well. Now, occupancy change, like I said, is very limited, and there are kind of no exceptions, with the exception of Central and Eastern Europe growing by 3%. Now, a late recovery for Central and Eastern European countries. So there's a lot more availability and a lot more affordability. When you're looking at markets like UK and Ireland that are running maybe 78% occupancy, Spain running 75% occupancy, there is very little room for growth. And of course, we've got some supply to contend with, but as I mentioned earlier, again, with one exception being Central and Eastern Europe growing by 1.2%, for the most part, supply is sub 1%. So let's go back to rate, which is what interests most of you in the room. Now, rate has grown, as you can see, at a country level significantly for some markets that compete with Turkey here. So to the right of the screen, I have shown some negative growth in France and Germany. You remember in the previous slide that is linked to the non-repeat events. But Turkey and Croatia, you can see, are kind of defeating the message or the narrative that we've had where the Southern and European divide, where Southern European countries are growing well. The resort versus urban narrative that we have as well, where resorts are growing well and urban destinations took a little bit longer to recover. But what's happening in Turkey and Croatia, which I've kind of linked as a competing market? We are starting to see some price resistance in the market. If you think about the economy of the key source markets, the UK, Germany in particular, these economies are really suffering where the low earners are not traveling domestically, nor are they traveling short haul as they have done before. High interest rates, high inflation, all putting pressure on prices, and we're starting to see the impact in this market. But if you think about price resistance and then you say, okay, but Turkey is right at the end here, we're actually 50% below many other European countries. So why is there price resistance here? And it's not just about hotels, right? It's about the whole tourism experience. So we've got the cost of air travel, the cost of ground transportation, we've got dining out, etc. So all of this is feeding into that reduced demand coming into Turkey and that reduced rate too. Now, putting geography to one side for a moment, let's look at class. So there have been very distinct trajectories for luxury and upper upscale hotels when compared to economy and mid-scale. Since 2022, we really saw that change. I mentioned resort versus urban, driving a lot of that. So you can see very clearly here that has continued in 2025, with luxury hotels growing by 7% in RevPAR terms, economy declining, and that squeezed middle, not really that much happening, RevPAR below inflation for the most part. But what stands out is the resort ADR performance. So here's a selection of resorts, and we have specifically added in US resorts for comparison, because US resorts would have always outperformed European resorts pre-COVID. But now, as you can see in the top 5, we've got 3 European destinations sitting in that top 5, and one of them, number 5, is the Turkish Riviera. And these are purely luxury and upper upscale class hotels, so achieving rates of 300 and 400 euro annually. But like I said, price perception, even on luxury and upper upscale classes, sometimes there is a ceiling. So we know that Turkey recovered far earlier than some other markets, like Morocco, for example, or even the Red Sea resorts. So is that price pressure now feeding down, and we see that downward pressure on demand, but also on rates? So let's compare a resort to an urban destination. So it's definitely a tale of two markets. So we have Istanbul declining by 4% in RevPAR terms, much of that due to rate, whereas we have the Turkish Riviera as a market growing by 3%, all of that driven by rate. Now, supply growth, and I'm sorry if you can't see maybe you can on that monitor, the yellow line here, but you can see supply growth is a key factor here. So Istanbul has had a huge amount of new supply come in over the last 2 years as compared to the Turkish Riviera, which has been fairly moderate. So that really absorbs a lot of the new demand coming in and therefore resulting in those occupancy declines. But let's break it down even further. So we've got the same narrative here where class does matter. So you can see, although the Turkish Riviera is growing, it's growing significantly for the luxury class of hotels. Istanbul, all classes are in decline, but guess what? Luxury is declining far slower than any of the other classes. So that is an important message that luxury and upper upscale traveller is still travelling and still willing to pay. And important to benchmark the two markets also to really draw some comparisons on what might look like negative growth. By comparison, the luxury class is doing quite well. Back to supply. Supply in Istanbul for the luxury and upper upscale segment has grown by 3% in 2025. Compare that to the Turkish Riviera, only 1%. So go figure why occupancies are declining in Istanbul. Again, sticking to the luxury and upper upscale story, you've got Istanbul in decline by 3% and Turkish Riviera growing by 5%, all of that in ADR. So occupancy had time to recover. Since 2020, by January 2022, occupancy had fully recovered for both Istanbul and the Turkish Riviera. And although they track a very, very similar trend as you go through each month, the big difference is that the resorts are able to widen that gap during the summer months, which is really driving the resort performance forward. And I have to say this is no different to the rest of Europe in terms of that gap. What's really interesting here between those two markets is that, again, full recovery, January 2022, but then fast forward to 2023 and look how that gap widens between the resort ADR versus the urban ADR. And that just puts the Turkish Riviera well ahead of all other European resorts that we track in terms of RevPAR performance year-to-date 2025 versus 2019, and Istanbul on par with urban destinations. So like I said, demand is under pressure, supply is not growing too much, so we really have to find the even keel here. Pricing power is really, really challenging. You can see across all classes, pricing power has been a challenge in 2025. There is some market inequality. So we have 3 key markets that we monitor in Turkey, and you can see that outside of Istanbul, we're seeing positive growth. Within Istanbul itself, we are seeing some negative growth. And at a city level, you can see that it's very, very varied. So all in all, Turkey has grown by 0.3% in occupancy in 2025 versus last year, but you can see that varies across the different markets. And if we go to ADR, Turkey has declined by 2% across the whole country, but you're still seeing some double-digit growth in some key markets, like Bodrum, for example, growing by 10%. So extreme differences even in one country, like Europe, like the globe. So let's look at the road ahead in the last minute. So like I said, supply growth has been very, very muted, which has aided occupancy growth. But supply growth is not going to stop. There are 2.5 million rooms in the pipeline across the globe. In Europe, that represents about 472,000 rooms. And that is all in planning, in final planning, and under construction. That could mean a 7% growth in the number of rooms in your market. But let's just look at construction, because in reality, what is going to be delivered in 2026, and beyond is what is perhaps in construction. So about a 3% growth of rooms if everything that was in construction were to come to fruition. And if we look at a European level, the UK always leads, closely followed by Germany in terms of supply change. But you can see Turkey here with a 4% lift in supply expected if all of these status were to come to fruition in 2026. The good news is, I mentioned the UK and Germany having a tough time, well, the consumer having a tough time. And I don't think that the UK budget will have changed much for the UK traveller in 2026. However, the consumer sentiment has certainly lifted. Interest rates are coming down, have come down for the Europeans, and CPI is also coming down. So there's definitely a little bit more positivity. And our partner, Tourism Economics, will tell us that short-haul travel is expected to grow in 2026, which is the fundamental for our forecasts. So growing up to international travel is going to grow up to 8.6% in 2026. And you can see a list of countries that will deliver on that. And again, looking to those valuable source markets for any country like Turkey, what are the valuable source markets? Germany, UK, all looking at positive growth in 2026. So this is definitely a good picture. So in summary, the class and market level performance variations are very different. Turkey is performing very similarly to the rest of Europe, although there are a few concerns about that affordability, about that price sensitivity, and about expanding that, even lengthening that season to enable more access, more travellers to come to Turkey in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Please join me on the stage a little bit more so we can take a family picture
Ah,
together.
fantastic. Thank you.
Miss Nare. Buyurunuz efendim. Şöyle ortaya doğru. In the middle,
Thank you
please.
very much. Thank you.
So we can have all the lights in the middle.
Okay.
Evet, bir fotoğraf çektirelim. Efendim Aoife Roche'u dinledik. Kendisi EMEA satışlardan sorumlu başkan yardımcısı STR. Konaklama sektörü görünümü başlığıyla bir sunum yaptı bize.